Hello. Welcome to the Deep and Durable Learning Podcast. This is the show for anyone who's struggled with the superficiality and short half-life of what passes for education. I'm Mike Gray, and I'm transitioning from nearly 45 years as a professor in higher education into this role of podcast host. This show is not primarily about bemoaning the state of education. Instead, I'll offer a positive, practical vision of how your learning can become both deep and durable. Join me for today's podcast, Who Needs Experts? This entire season we've been talking about epistemology. That is, the study of what it means to know something, including what counts as evidence and the difference between opinion and justifiable belief. Justifiable true belief is the standard which has stood for 2 millennia, defining what it means to know. The United States psyche is rooted in rugged individualism with a do-it-yourself mentality. So, the question I'm exploring today is, who needs experts? Frankly, experts of one stripe or another have been perennial whipping boys in the mind and talk of the average person. For instance, economists have been criticized. George Bernard Shaw is supposed to have said, if all economists were laid end to end, they would not reach a conclusion. Of course, Shaw was not an economist, so he was looking from the outside at economics as a hopeless muddle. Another version of that quote I've heard is, if all economists were laid end to end, it would probably be a good thing. Well, since we've entertained that objection with regard to the expertise of economists, let me put in a conciliatory comment. This actually appeared in an editorial in The Week magazine, dated September 3rd, 2021, written by William Falk as the editor's letter. And Falk said, quoting now an economist, "When my information changes, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?" Falk says some version of this quote, variously attributed to economist John Maynard Keynes or Paul Samuelson, should actually serve as a guiding principle for anyone trying to make wise decisions. Alas, it rarely does. We human beings hate being wrong. We hate it with a passion. Even the most successful people often have brittle egos that can't withstand a change of mind, no matter how much contrary information pours in. Consequences are usually painful. Falk has put his finger on something here, which we, as outsiders to many kinds of expertise, can point the finger at those experts, but we ourselves are inflexible. When our information changes significantly in profound ways, in foundational ways, we really should say, I really don't have a choice but to change my mind. That's wisdom. Well, I'm not selling books today, but if I were, I would point you to the 2017 book by Tom Nichols called The Death of Expertise: The Campaign Against Established Knowledge and Why It Matters. Nichols points out the problem that Falk has alluded to. Well, he puts it differently. He says these back in 2017 now. These are dangerous times. Never have so many people had so much access to so much knowledge and yet have been so resistant to learning anything. That's a strong statement, but I think a justifiable statement. Let's take a look at it. He says, after warning us that we're in dangerous times, he says, never have so many people had so much access to so much knowledge. Well, knowledge, yes, and information and data. We've talked about that on previous podcasts. We're well into more than 2 decades of the internet and the information explosion, which overwhelms us anytime we do a Google search. There is resistance here that Nichols points out. Resistance, he said, to learning anything, but maybe even more basic, resistance to authorities who tell us what is true. That telling us what is true is a reference to established knowledge. And people today have a resistance to anybody telling them something that's true that runs counter to their so-called common sense. The result is of a tendency to level all disagreement between individuals, including disagreements between the uninformed and the misinformed and true experts in an area, as a mere difference of opinion. In other words, they're not willing to grant any weight whatsoever to expertise. It is simply a matter of a difference of opinion. And the implication there, then, is that there's not a right answer. I'm just as right as you are. We have a difference of opinion, and that's all. And below that, we could say what we have is a view that truth is personal rather than communal. I mean, that there is no right answer that I'm accountable to and you're accountable to, and one of us is wrong, or maybe both of us are wrong. And so even deeper, then, is a resistance to the idea of true education as an instrument of transformation from ignorance to, at best, enlightenment of some sort. Instead, education is for personal affirmation rather than for transformation. So I reject any education that does not affirm me personally. Anything that expects me to change is out of the question because I'm already informed. This is not just a modern phenomenon. It's been a long time coming, and if we had the time and inclination, we could point this out over hundreds of years, at least the last several hundred years. But let me take a step back to before I was born. The publication, The Lost Tools of Learning, published in 1947, short pamphlet by Dorothy Sayers, who commented on education in her time and asked this question. Sayers says, "Do you sometimes have an uneasy suspicion that the product of modern educational methods," 1947 methods she's referring to, "is less good than he or she might be at disentangling fact from opinion?" Boy, we just talked about that. "And the proven from the plausible." So she lays the difficulty at the feet of modern educational methods, since she's writing about the lost tools of learning. I think there's something even more basic than just a flawed approach to education that produces a people who don't know the difference between a fact and an opinion, between the proven and what Sayers calls the plausible. Since Tom Nichols' book, The Death of Expertise, is so pivotal, I'm going to use some quotes from Nichols to move us through a little bit of perspective adjustment if you're not already there with me about this dismissal of expertise. So Nichols says early in his book, not only do increasing numbers of lay people lack basic knowledge, they reject fundamental rules of evidence, and they refuse to learn how to make a logical argument. It is deplorably true that many people, an increasing number of people, lack basic knowledge. I don't say that in any elitist way. There are many different ways of substantiating that judgment. The United States is way back in terms of basic literacy in regard to science attainment, language skills, history knowledge, and a variety of other perennial objectives of education. So it wouldn't be hard to demonstrate that lay people have not benefited from their education in ways that generations past perhaps have benefited. But more concerning is the rejection part here. Nichols says, in addition to that lack of basic knowledge, they, that is increasing numbers of lay people, reject. So there's an active sense of this. They reject fundamental rules of evidence, and they refuse to learn how to make a logical argument. Of course, if you were to point that out to an individual, them's fighting words, as somebody once said. So we have, in previous podcasts, talked about the difference between information, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And these folks equate, at best, the collection of information, some of it dubious, to be sure, with knowledge, and presume an understanding that they don't possess, and a wisdom of action that's not validated by their mastery of the concepts that form the basis for understanding and wisdom. Nichols goes on, he says in a few pages later, in some ways, battling established knowledge is worse than ignorance because it is unfounded arrogance. So it's not just resistance, it's unfounded arrogance. The outrage of an increasingly narcissistic culture that cannot endure even the slightest hint of inequality of any kind. End of quote. Lay people view experts as elitists who look down their noses at lay people instead of as individuals who have chosen to pursue specialized training that actually augurs to the good of humanity. Instead, because these experts say they know things that don't sound like common sense to the lay people resist and, in fact, substitute their own notion of common sense as more powerful, more palatable, and more likely to be true than what the experts have invested years of specialized training to achieve. So Nichols goes on, and on page 5 of his book, he says, the death of expertise is not just a rejection of existing knowledge. It is fundamentally a rejection of science and dispassionate rationality, which are the foundations of modern civilization. What he's saying here when he talks about a rejection of science and dispassionate rationality is what's really being rejected is critical thinking. Critical thinking that dispassionately is a term he's using here. That is, I don't allow my emotions to get in the road of the search for what's actually true, true being justifiable on the basis of reason and evidence. That asking for that is asking way too much of lay people, and it's just a tool of the powerful to disenfranchise the average person. So critical thinking itself is under attack, and the process of critical thinking is, as Nichols has pointed out, the foundations of modern civilization. Many folks who criticize the expertise of individuals have a rejection of theory. A rejection of theory because it has, in their minds, no practical ramifications. I remember encountering 40 years ago some individuals who were influential in certain educational circles who applauded arithmetic but hated mathematics because they believed mathematics, once you get beyond basic computation, was a tool of elitists to move in directions that they weren't comfortable with. So arithmetic is important and necessary. They would have been of the reading, writing, and arithmetic school. But mathematics is a bridge too far. Mathematics gives rise to all kinds of evil, including statistics, including irrational numbers, including the use of mathematics to make predictions that factor into decision making. So mathematics is the theory part, and we can safely abandon the theory part because it's just a tool of the powerful, I would add now. The people who understand things that I don't understand, or who are at least making it as though there's something going on that I don't understand, nor do I have any desire to understand mathematics, these folks would say. Nichols moves on, and on page 20 of his book, he comes down again and says, the issue is not indifference to established knowledge. It's the emergence of, and this is another level, of a positive hostility to such knowledge. Positive hostility to established knowledge. And again, established knowledge as it collides with the view of the average layperson. And on page 28, Nichols rightly says, what we have is a childish rejection of authority in all of its forms, including the authority of academic disciplines, I might add, coupled to an insistence, and that insistence we hear loud and clear around us all the time today, is that strongly held opinions are indistinguishable from facts. Strongly held opinions are indistinguishable from facts. And Nichols says what we have really is a desire for validation that I don't need to provide anything as a rationale for my opinion, that if I hold it strongly enough, then you have to grant it the status of factuality. And if you don't, then you're being an authoritarian and setting an unreasonable standard. Well, so there's lots going on when we talk about this collision of experts and lay people. But there's much more at stake than the ego of experts who perceive that they have been mistreated. So let me give 4 answers to the question, why do we need experts? Here are my 4 answers, and we'll explore each one of them briefly, the first one in more detail than the others. So here are my 4 reasons why we need experts. First of all, experts predict. They predict on the basis of their knowledge, and they're pointing out the implications and the consequences of that knowledge, to be a little bit more precise. Secondly, experts correct error so that our models of reality can improve. Third, experts create solutions to problems. And fourth, experts mentor learners to help them change their thinking. So let's take each of those in turn, the first one in more detail. We need experts because experts predict. They have the ability to predict. Unfortunately, we listen selectively because we haven't really given up our position as experts who rule over the plausibility of expertise. So let me observe a couple things, situations where we're more comfortable with experts. And the first is we're more comfortable when there are short-term predictions being made by the experts. An example that I've experienced a couple times in the last 8 months or so is the ability of experts to predict tornadoes in my area. My area in the upstate of South Carolina is not really prone to tornadoes, but we've had 2 instances, one just a few weeks ago, where it was obvious the weather had taken a turn for the worse. My phone notified me that we were looking at severe weather predicted. So I used my phone and went online and found my local weatherman using radar that's in the area that the television station owns, and he is able to track the storm down to street level. And on one instance, he actually mentioned something that was like 3 streets over from me as a place where potentially a tornado was developing. Well, I didn't take that opportunity, as we were under tornado watch for an hour or hour and a half, to criticize meteorologists and the fact, that they always get it wrong. Rather, I took his recommendation seriously, and to his credit, I found out the day after in the newspaper that several times when he pointed out an area, fortunately not in my immediate area, but in the upstate of South Carolina, that where he pointed out it was likely a tornado was actually going to be developing right there, that the newspaper and the National Weather Service pointed out there had indeed been tornadoes in those areas. So his credibility was enhanced. So we're more comfortable with experts when they're making short-term predictions, and I guess we could say, and we really have no recourse. Something similar would be in the aftermath of a heart attack. If you actually had a heart attack, you're probably going to follow the recommendations of the EMTs on the way into the hospital, your cardiologist in the hospital, A recommendation for open heart surgery is probably not something you're going to contest, or the insertion of a stent or whatever. So we're more comfortable with the predictive ability of experts if they're making short-term predictions. To get a little more light in my application, we're more comfortable with practical predictions. So we don't have a problem with going to Home Depot or Lowe's and asking questions about paint compatibility and whether I need to put a primer down before I use this paint that you carry. So practical predictions, we're good with that. Generally, we follow the experts. We're more comfortable when the predictions don't affect us with any immediacy. So predictions about the war in Afghanistan, which has concluded, but what's the future in Afghanistan? The average American just wanted out of Afghanistan, and predictions about how difficult the future might be are not things that they spend a lot of time thinking about. Talk about withdrawing troops from Iraq, and the same kind of thing comes up. Those are more theoretical kinds of predictions. They don't have an immediate impact on me, and maybe my overriding concern is just that we disentangle ourselves from foreign wars. On the other hand, when experts make long-term predictions, those long-term predictions are particularly difficult for us when we don't see what the expert says they see. For instance, a physical exam and a diagnosis of cancer, when I feel fine, probably the expert has gotten it wrong. At least that's what I want to believe. Or a prediction from a diagnosis that leads to a prediction that's troubling or limiting, like with your history, your weight, and family history, you need to start taking statin drugs, change your diet, exercise to avoid heart problems, or to make sure that you don't end up in the hospital with another heart attack. We also have difficulty when we have a diagnosis and there are no treatment options. Cancer is one of those situations. Perhaps the diagnosis and prognosis are bleak, and people then are prone to seek out experts who will give them a treatment option. Alternative medicine, traveling to Tijuana, changing their own diet and taking unusual supplements and so forth. So experts predict, and we need them for that, but there are kinds of predictions we are much less comfortable with. Secondly, experts correct error in our concepts, our models. There is uncertainty in those models, and they're always learning and tuning up the models and making models that correspond more closely to reality. There's been a great deal of uncertainty in the current pandemic because scientists are learning on the fly. It is interesting to me as a microbiologist that most people are, or maybe I shouldn't say most, many people that I know are comfortable with the idea that COVID is a real disease, but it's primarily spread by contact with contaminated materials. And so they're comfortable with disinfection, deep cleaning. But the experts now call that, for the most part, COVID theater. Like, it looks like we're doing something, but it doesn't have a profound effect on the incidence community spread of COVID. Where we have moved is that this idea of COVID being transmitted by inanimate objects, by exposure only to droplets from close contacts has actually largely been superseded by a recognition of the importance of aerosols, and that aerosol avoidance is the best thing that you can do to keep from coming down with COVID. And of course, being vaccinated is a piece of that, but we now know there are breakthrough infections, and we didn't know that for certain a year ago. So experts are sometimes criticized in the pandemic. They certainly have been, because they can't give us definitive answers. But in fact, there's this continuous error correction process that's leading us to a better understanding of how to address the pandemic. Third, experts create solutions. I think one of the most important things that President Trump did was mobilize this Operation Warp Speed to produce COVID vaccines. Other solutions are a series of things that have improved agricultural productivity to where only a few individuals are necessary to feed 100 individuals, as opposed to more than half the population being involved in agriculture. A mundane example would be a home security system like Ring or something else that you can install, that you can monitor on your cell phone, that you don't need experts for. Fourth, and where we're going to finish up today, is that we need experts because experts can mentor learners so that learners can change their thinking. To be self-taught is generally to be poorly taught. So experts will kindly but firmly create what's sometimes called cognitive dissonance, that if the naive learner believes such and such, then what about this as a ramification or an application of the way the neophyte is articulating their view. So it's the job of an expert mentor to point out contrary evidence, illogic, inconsistency. Those might be viewed as negatives. Creating cognitive dissonance doesn't feel good. Pointing out these flaws of contrary evidence, illogic, and inconsistency doesn't feel good. But those are actually part of what it means to learn, because learning is conceptual change, not primarily conceptual invention. Experts serve as mentors to suggest more productive paths of inquiry, better ways that we can think about this. Maybe we need to think about something else. They can point out analogies to things that we've demonstrated we already understand as a tool, an entry point into understanding something we're still working on grasping. Many other things we could say, but this is a good place to finish up today, because I hope it strikes a responsive chord with you. I hope as you've listened to this season's podcast, you've grown in discernment. You've recognized that collecting information is not even close to the ability to justify your knowledge with reason and evidence. And I hope, as a result, that you are committed to a path that will transform you through the process of knowing deeply. Experts can be your guides, your mentors, your friends in this exciting journey. Expertise in understanding the brain has put us in a position to teach and to learn much more effectively. I'll be taking off the month of December from podcasting, but join me on January 8th for the first of several podcasts on how the brain learns and what that means for transformational learning. Enjoy the holidays, and let's get together on January 8th. Please take a moment to rate, review, and comment on this podcast. I hope you'll recommend it to your friends. Visit deepanddurable.com, deepanddurable.com, for more resources, including a blog that takes a deeper dive into the topic of expertise.